In this video, I will help you to understand the workflow of bi-directional contract testing. Just like any other contract testing approach, bi-directional contract testing has two main entities: the consumer and the provider. As mentioned, you can see two entities, the consumer and the provider. The main difference between bi-directional contract testing and consumer-driven contract testing is that, unlike consumer-driven approach where only the consumer provides a contract, in bi-directional contract testing method, both the consumer and the provider provides their own contracts. The pact broker compares these two contracts to check for any incompatibilities. First, let's find out what goes on in the consumer end of our test. Similar to consumer-driven contract tests, the consumer first writes a unit test that runs against a mock provider. This mock provider can be set up using pact within the same unit test, or can be set up independently using some other mocking tool. You can see here that we will be running our unit test against the mock provider. The mock provider first needs to be configured to return an expected response whenever it receives a specific request. We need to configure the interaction that the mock provider will have with the consumer test. In other words, we need to set the response that the mock provider has to return whenever it receives a specific request. Once the mock provider's interaction is configured, we can go ahead and pass the actual request to it from our unit test. The provider receives this request and checks if the request matches with the expected request that was configured to it. As you can see, the consumer sends the request to the mock provider. The provider compares this request with the expected request that was configured to it to see if it matches. If the request received matches with the expected request, then the mock provider returns the response that it was configured to return. As you can see, the mock provider gets the response that it is configured to return, and sends that response back to the test. The test checks if the response received matches with the expected response that the mock provider was configured to return. If it matches, then the test passes, and the whole interaction that was configured to the mock provider is captured into a contract. You can see here, the interaction between the mock provider and the consumer unit test gets captured and stored in a contract. The contract is then uploaded to pact flow. Now, you might be wondering what pact flow is, right? Pact flow is an advanced pact broker that has features required to use pact at a large scale. These include single sign-on, user management, improved UI, support for bi-directional contract testing and many more. As mentioned previously, you can see here that the consumer contract is uploaded to pact flow. We are done with the consumer end of our test. Next, let's look at what goes on in the provider end. The provider first needs to generate a provider contract such as an OpenAPI specification for the provider API. This may be created by hand or generated by code. As mentioned, you can see the generation of the provider contract, that is, an OpenAPI specification here. The provider contract is validated by testing it against the provider using any functional API testing tool such as Postman, or even through code using tools like Swashbuckle or Schema Thesis. The test results are stored in a file which is later uploaded to pact flow along with the provider contract. As mentioned previously, you can see here that the provider contract, that is the OpenAPI documentation, is tested against the provider, and the test results are stored into a file. The provider contract and the test results are then uploaded to pact flow. As mentioned, you can see the provider contract and the test results being uploaded to pact flow. Now that both the contracts are uploaded, pact flow compares the consumer contract with the provider contract to check if the consumer contract is a valid subset of the provider contract. As mentioned, you can see the consumer contract getting compared with the provider contract to check for any incompatibilities. After the comparison, Packed flow generates a verification result that indicates if either the consumer or the provider breaches each other's contract or not. There you have it. That is how bi-directional contract testing works. I hope this video helped you understand this concept better. Thank you for watching.